a kind of reminder, a cheat sheet, if you will. I'm guessing that many of us are familiar, but it may be helpful to review anyway. When we talk about the Bible, when we talk about the Torah, what is it that we mean? So the Hebrew Bible is often referred to by this acronym, Tanakh. And I mean, here's an easy answer, but if anyone knows what those three
of course
parts of the acronym are for, I may have spelled it out for you, but if anyone wants to kind of chime in, I know that this is probably familiar to most of you.
Torah, Nevi'im, and well, it's right on. It's on. It's on
exactly. I'm giving you the
a
cheat sheet. But...
Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim.
Right, exactly. And so when we talk about Torah, we're talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 5 books. And the acronyms here are reflective of the Hebrew titles for these sections of our Jewish canon. And it's the Torah that we read at synagogue, at your Shir Tikva congregation, I'm sure, on a weekly basis. They're divided into portions or parashot. And I want to just emphasize as we move into this that when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, we are talking about a composite collection of texts. So there is not one single, we're not presuming one single set of authorship. Traditionally, there is the assumption that the 5 books of Torah in Jewish, in the Jewish perspective, are authored by the prophet Moses. That is not necessarily the prevailing scholarly view. It is more of a traditional one. And so we are presuming here from a point of informed skepticism and the knowledge that these are written documents. These were compiled over a series of many centuries, and they are important to the community or communities that are producing and preserving them. The question of sort of truth and accuracy, there are different meanings. And I think what we find in the ancient world is that there is not the same holding firm to one account of history, one account of how things are or were. And so, you know, all of these narratives and these stories that we find within the Hebrew Bible are true in the extent that they are being written and preserved and told. They are true to the community that produced them and that held on to them. But we are moving from a point where we are not assuming necessarily that the final author here was God or Moses. These are human people writing on behalf of a deity, a God that they believe in and that they see their history as being informed by. And so that's an important sort of caveat to make when we talk about what we would think of as sacred literature. They are sacred to people, but they are also produced by people. And so the other thing too, I did just mute someone, but if you're not muted, yeah, hopefully that helps with the echo. I did just want to emphasize as well the role that I think we are all familiar with, that Jews have often been referred to as people of the book, and that it is, you know, the Torah in particular that shapes and colors a lot of our beliefs, our practices, our way of life. And so that's why I thought that it was important to start with the Torah when we're thinking about sort of the roots of Judaism and where and how gender comes to be conceived, comes to be depicted, comes to be understood. Were there any questions? Hopefully this is all familiar and you're like, please move on to the next slide. But just in case, you know, there is something here that anyone has any questions. All right, we will move to the next slide. So as we go in this conversation, oh, I see there's something in the chat here. All good, awesome, we love to hear it. As we move forward, I kind of wanted to frame our time here tonight in terms of some of these core questions that I've collected here. And so, you know, it might be helpful to kind of think out loud together if we have any ideas of what we think these answers might be. There is no one right answer. There is no one solution. But if we have any perspective, or if we want to come back to these questions, I thought they would be important to kind of highlight and call our attention to right now. So how is gender understood in the Hebrew Bible? And is gender different or distinct from sex? Is there any insight into that? Or even not in terms of the Hebrew Bible? I know that a lot of us will distinguish today between what we mean when we say gender versus sex. Are there any sort of thoughts or questions? Or yeah, Shoshana, I see a hand.
Yeah, what I remember from school is that it was confusing and the rabbis didn't always agree.
That's actually a pretty good answer for most things in Judaism. It's complicated and the rabbis didn't agree, but you're absolutely right there. Are there any kind of thoughts, and perhaps as well, when we're thinking backwards in time, we're obviously informed by our intentions, our questions, our interests in the modern world. But what do we think about, what do we think might be different for people in ancient times when they're describing what we might refer to as gender? How are they perceiving it? What is the function or definition of, male, female, woman, man, anything in between? Any ideas? Any ideas why that might be a little different? Totally fine if we don't have an answer right now. We can continue to ruminate. Also, this term that we're going to come back to, patriarchal. What does it mean to call biblical narratives patriarchal? And how is this similar or different from the patriarchy, quote unquote, that we are still experiencing in modern society? Any thoughts or questions on that? Alongside that, kind of how does patriarchy maybe operate differently in biblical times? So what are some of the distinctions? Oh, I see something in the chat. I will keep saying, oh, every time. Lots of questions. Yes. I promise I'm going to start to answer or ask more questions shortly. I think it's helpful to get us in this mindset of openness and asking, because that is also so essential to Jewish thought and Jewish identity. But are there any ideas of, oh,
I'm no expert, but I think for a long time the focus was on the male characters, and sort of it was more in the reform movement that some of the prayers added some of the matriarchs, and then certainly there's aspects of blessings getting passed down to the eldest sons and things of that nature. So, but at the same time, we're a matriarchal religion where your motherly lineage determines your Judaism historically, or in more conservative or ways. So
yeah, no, those are really good points. And what we're going to find actually that's really interesting is that sort of emphasis on the matriarchal lines is a longstanding tradition in Judaism, but it actually does not go back all the way to these biblical texts. In a lot of these Genesis narratives, we're going to find that lineage is very much defined in terms of the men. There's actually a really boring for most people. If you find it interesting, you probably have spent too much time reading Bible. But early on in Genesis, there are these series of lists of the births of all of these different figures, and often they're referred to as the begat lists, because the translation is this person begat this person, who begat this person, who begat this person. And what's really interesting is that it's not the men who are begetting much of anything. It's the women who are going through that process. But some of the language around that is that this man begets another man, whose son is this, who begets this man. And so there is really this kind of androcentric or male-focused emphasis in a lot of these early texts for sure. And I think something to kind of keep in mind and come back to as well is how has biblical narrative shaped our more modern values? How do the stories that we're talking about today, how do they still continue to inform our present day thoughts, our laws in some cases, you know, the ways in which you know, the country that y'all are in is being run, and also this idea of what does it mean to operate as a woman in a society where you may have less power, and is this notion that we're going to come back to of patriarchy kind of all encompassing, or are there exceptions or exemptions, and like what power and influence do women have in a society that is clearly maybe operated more on behalf of male progeny. So here I just have a silly little image of RBG, which I thought we might appreciate. But yeah, so we can come back to these questions. Now we turn back to the Torah. I always like to say, let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. And here we have God as depicted in Lego by a white man in a beard. Of course, the Torah never describes God this way. He is rather adorable. I don't know if that helps with his all-knowing, almighty, all-powerful depiction, but I think he's cute like this, so I kept it. And so the translation that I'm drawing here is from the Jewish Publication Society, but does anybody want to read out either the English, or if you're feeling fancy, the Hebrew part here? This is the opening of the Torah, just in case you're sick of my voice.
I'll
Okay,
read it.
oh, perfect.
I'll do the English.
Yeah, no pressure for the Hebrew. I just thought I would offer.
Yeah. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water.
Perfect. Thank you. So
Simon, I'll do the Hebrew just for the
perfect. Perfect.
בראשית ברא אלוהים את השמיים ואת הארץ, והארץ הייתה תוהו ובוהו, וחושך על פני תהום, ורוח אלוהים מרחפת על פני המים.
Thank you. תודה רבה. Much better than my butchered American accent would have been. So in the beginning, or when God began to create, there's a lot. This first word, Bereshit, of which the book of Genesis gets its name in Hebrew, can actually be translated in a lot of different ways. So when God began, or in the beginning, when of God's creation, when he began to create heaven and earth. Here we have this depiction of the world as being unformed and void. So tohu vavohu, actually my favorite translation I ever heard of this. It's really, it doesn't mean anything. These words are kind of more onomatopoeic, or just kind of the sound of it. So the best translation I ever heard, which is not literal, was chaos and shmeos. Just there's really nothing going on there. It's murky, and there is a darkness over the surface of the deep, over these waters, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. So we have a particular view of creation as kind of this watery, murky, unformed void. And so what do we have here? This should probably be familiar. The first day we get the division between light and darkness. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, the darkness he called night, and there was evening and morning, a first day. We're going to see here that there was evening and there was morning. This is kind of a common formula that's used in this first chapter to describe the account of creation. On the second day here, as I said, we have these murky waters that are kind of undifferentiated, that aren't really doing much of anything, and they're kind of just flowing and doing their thing. And so here we actually get a separation of these waters. So I really like this illustration here on your left on the screen. I like to think of the waters that are being separated here as a kind of force field. So let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water. So the idea here, they're not working from a scientific uh, you know, 21st century informed view of the world, but they see blue up top, they see blue below. Obviously, it's water on both ends. And this little space in between the Earth must be this kind of middle ground of this force field, this separated little bubble. And so, we get sky, evening and morning, a second day. Great. We skip ahead a little bit to creation, which is where things get really interesting of humanity. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. So you may be wondering, why am I emphasizing this? I already know this, Simon. I know the story. I think it's really important to emphasize here the just this language which has become so familiar to us, but calling attention to the nuances. So let us make man in our image. It's important to note here that the word for man, Hebrew is a gendered language, but the general form is masculine. So when we say a man, it could be a human, it could be an actual male person, but there is no real distinction in the ancient Hebrew here. And then what do we get specifically that might actually point to the gender or sex of this creation? God created man, or humanity, the word is really Adam, in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So in this instance, we find that at the point of creation, there is really a simultaneous creation, apparently, according to this narrative, of men and women together. Yeah, I see there's a hand that was raised, Ellis.
So this reading seems to include male and female in him.
It does. And I mean, I think if you're familiar with French or with Spanish, even if you don't know Hebrew, the kind of the plural form in particular could be masculine or feminine. The general term is going to be masculine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't encompass females. So it becomes tricky to translate this, but here specifically, we do seem to find male and female, this simultaneous creation. God blessed them, not just one of them, and said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth, yada, yada, yada. Guess what? God saw all that he had made and found it very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. This seems like a very neat account of creation. Also, what's fun on this little image here is that the actual Hebrew doesn't say, let me make man or humans in my image. It says, let us make humans in our image. And there is this kind of open question about who that we is referring to, that first common plural, and whether God is acting alone, whether this is a God of ancient Near Eastern myth, who perhaps acts as part of a committee, as part of a pantheon of other gods. Not all of these texts that we find in the Hebrew Bible assume a strict form of monotheism or a belief in just one God. There is always this elevation and emphasis on the God of the Hebrews and the Israelites. But this narrative does not seem to fully discount the idea that there could be other divine creatures. I see Nan raised a hand.
Yeah, I just had a question.
Yeah.
I don't know Hebrew. The second paragraph down, and God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, where it says he created him, is the plural on that I'm not plural.
The singular?
The singular. Yes.
So the singular, yeah, no, sorry, thank you for that question. I think I get what you're asking. What is the distinction here? The interesting thing with a language like Hebrew, I don't know if you're familiar, it's the same with French as well, where if something is explicitly feminine, it will be gendered as feminine. If you're just talking in generalities, the baseline is the male form of the word. And so there isn't necessarily a way other than through context to know, like a general person is the general masculine form of that noun. I see there's another hand as well. Aaron?
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yep.
just for reference, there are actually lots of stories in the Torah where it's not clear whether there's only one God.
Right.
And there's a book by a guy named James Kugel called The Great Shift, where he talks about the evolution of the concept of God as time went on. Just
Totally.
so we know that
Thank
this
you
is
so much. If
this is
anyone
not a
wants, if you want to
one-off.
type that book recommendation in the chat, Google is an excellent scholar, and his name always makes me a little hungry, especially at this time of year. But definitely there's a lot, and if anyone wants any further resources aside from the Google book, there's a lot on kind of the history of how Israelite and eventually Jewish monotheism kind of comes to be and the progression, but it's definitely not assumed from the get-go of all of these narratives and texts that we have today. So there was another
just clarify
hand
my
for Anne.
question?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going back to that same line, but my question is where it says he created him, is that is the Hebrew there actually in the singular?
Yes.
Okay, so there, and then male, female, he created them.
That is plural.
Different form for the them in the Hebrew?
So the general form for them, unless it is all feminine, like even if you have one masculine subject, then then it defaults to the masculine form. Right, so even if it was like, I'm just opening the Hebrew again just to give you a clearer sense. But 26. So let us make humankind in our image. Vayavara Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo. So, and God created the human, Ha-Adam. So Adam, take to be the name of Adam. We've named that first male Adam, but the term Adam really is just referring to a person. And we're going to find as well that it's related to the same root as Adama in Hebrew, which means earth. And there is this connection between the earth that the Adam or the human comes from.
So it would be as accurate to translate this as he created the human being, male and female, he created humanity or the humans.
Yes, that is, and there are lots of different sort of gender inclusive translations that would accommodate that. I like to kind of look at what's in the text and then how much then is a choice. Anytime you translate, there is a choice in context in how you choose to read something.
Well, that's what I'm asking. I'm not that I'm trying to impose my preference on it,
no.
But in the Hebrew, can you actually say that it means male person in that singular form?
You cannot.
Okay.
Yeah, the default is masculine, but that does not necessarily require that it is a single male subject. And the general noun form the nominal form is masculine, if that helps. And so we have this one account of creation with humans seeming to come to being at the same time. And then what happens? We seem to actually have a separate narrative. So from Genesis 1 to the second chapter, Genesis 2, verse 4, partway through that verse, there seems to be a divide where all of a sudden creation is happening all over again. The creation that just came about in the first chapter is being retold and seemingly from a different perspective. Yeah, and Yair pointed out Adam, Adama, a good translation if we wanted to be really kind of inclusive and also literal with what the Hebrew is and is not saying, earthling, could be a way of kind of maintaining that connection to the earth that is established in the Hebrew term Adam. And that we just have a definite article with it. Ha is the or the. There is no clear explanation of what kind of Adam, what kind of human earthling person from the earth it is. So yeah, thank you, Yair, for that clarification as well. And so what's really interesting here is we had this seemingly sort of balanced co-creation of male and female that he created them. And then from Genesis 2:4b through Genesis 3, we actually see creation happening all over again. So if you recall from a couple slides ago, we had this idea, this conception of creation as coming out of this like murky, watery kind of chaos that wasn't really defined. It was like loosey-goosey, everything was kind of mixed up. But here we have a very different account. When the Lord God made heaven and earth, when no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field had not yet sprouted, because the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the soil. But a flow would well up from the ground and water the whole surface of the earth. So that's really interesting. On the one hand, we had this state of kind of watery chaos or watery nondescriptness. And now we're seeing a different vision of creation and the pre-created state as being fundamentally dry, and it's just this single little flow of water that actually starts to hydrate and populate the earth. And so at this point, the Lord God forms man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And what's interesting here again, to take it back to Nan's question, is that here we will find later in this chapter that there does seem to be a valence of actually a male person rather than a human who may or may not be male. So we get this account of men not coming on the sixth day of creation in this hyper-organized kind of structure, but rather we seem to get man as a kind of gardener figure. So it says, and from the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing. He took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till and tend it. And this is actually a common trope that we see in other ancient Mesopotamian literature, that, you know, taking care of the earth, that maintaining the plants and all of the living things is a draining task. And so you find in creation accounts like the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish that the gods create humans to do all of this dirty work. And so there seem to be these parallels to other accounts of creation from the ancient world out of which this narrative is arising. So it's interesting to note. Ellis, you had your hand up?
How do you know that the term man in that highlighted section doesn't also include women?
So we're going to get to there. Just if you were looking without context, you wouldn't necessarily know that. But what's really interesting is that what comes next is this whole section of finding a fitting helper for man. And I have fitting helper in quotes. This is not a literal translation. This is the Jewish Publication Society's translation. And it's a nice way of kind of putting lipstick on a pig. But it's not necessarily, it's also a really hard thing to translate. The Hebrew here is ezer kenegdo. So for anyone who is familiar with Hebrew, the first word here, which, can you see my cursor where I'm pointing?
Yep.
So ezer, the root of that comes from the verb to help. And neged, which is the root of this word in the middle here, kenegdo. Neged means opposite or opposed. So ke here is the is an article. So the helper that is sort of opposed or opposite, and then we get this third person added. So that is opposed to him, not opposed in a sense of, you know, fighting, but just that is opposite or is somehow different from him. And so God decides in this narrative that man needs some kind of partner who will be a kind of counterbalance. And so this is how we get in this narrative the creation of all of the different animals, all the birds of the sky. The man is naming them. The man has this dominion and this naming, but he says, none of these are quite right. It's a little bit of the kind of the porridge and you know, this one's too hot, this one's too warm, this one is not a fitting helper for me. And so at this point, the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that spot. So here's something else that's just interesting to notice when we talk about sort of another reason why we think this seems to be a totally different story is that actually the names that we find of God here and the ways in which God is described are different. So when you see in any English translation, all capitals Lord, that is referring to the four-letter name of God, Yod He Vav He, which in Jewish practice we would just pronounce as Adonai. We would not say that name out loud. But interestingly enough, the first narrative did not actually name God as explicitly as this. And so one of the ways that scholars have identified these different textual traditions that have been put together and redacted together is through these names of God. And so here, anyway, back to the story, the Lord God fashioned the rib that he had taken, and he brought her to the man. The man said, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man was she taken." And this is one of those rare instances where a Hebrew pun actually works in English as well. And so, Lizut Yikara Isha, so Isha being the feminine form of an Ish, of a man, which is separate from the more general Adam, which refers more just to a human. Ish is always masculine. Isha is the feminine form of that otherwise masculine, defaulted masculine noun. So we have Isha, ki me ish, lukacha zot. So from the man was she taken, she will be not ish, but isha, or in this case, in English, not man, but woman. And so hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh. So here what we actually have is a kind of explanation for why there are these two sexes, why they cling together. And if you believe the account of this story versus the other one, or perhaps maybe just in conjunction with, there seems to be a contradiction here. Were men and women created at the same time in the image of God? Or was the Ish, the man, created and the woman out of his rib? And that has all kinds of implications. Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, is a great place to start. It's a little bit of an old source, but it's very readable and very engaging. So definitely a good place to start if this is new. It starts to get a little in the woods, in the mud, but it's definitely a great source. Thank you for that. So then I think we're also familiar with what comes next. I always like to call emphasis to the fact that we think of this fruit in the Garden of Eden as an apple, but scholars have deduced that apples probably were not growing, and there's no real specification in the Hebrew, it's just a fruit. And so a popular guess is that maybe this story is actually talking about figs. So I just kind of think that puts a different valence on it, but has no real implications, just the more you know. And so here we have this instance, which I think, again, many of us are familiar with the serpent approaching the woman, saying, "Did God really say you shall not eat any tree of the garden?" Which, of course, if I wasn't condensing this story, God says, you can eat from any tree of this garden, just not of the one of the knowledge of good and bad. And the serpent says, you're not going to die, but God knows that as soon as you eat of that one tree, your eyes will be opened and you will be like divine beings, like gods. And so here, if this was a different course topic and we were going to look back at Google, this is another really interesting place where there seems to be this recognition of the kind of division between humans and deities, and it maybe is not so far away. And so that's just another interesting aspect. But we have the snake, who we've characterized the serpent as a kind of trickster figure. He convinces the woman to do something which God does not want, but he sort of deceives her in asking a question that is actually not a fair account of what God has said. God gave a particular command. The snake sort of twists it in his, serpentine manner, and makes the whole premise seem kind of silly. And the woman thinks, okay, I may as well eat this. It looks pretty good for food. And so she took of its fruit and ate. She gave some to her husband and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. So here's Modesty Culture 101. I think we're familiar with that in Massachusetts. But what comes next, I think of it as a kind of blame game. And so at this point, also interesting to note, this all-powerful God calls out to the man and says, "Where are you?" Because he's kind of hiding. He says, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked." And God says, "Who told you were naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?" "Of course I didn't do this myself. It was the woman that you put at my side." I think many women are probably familiar with that kind of exchange. It's obviously her fault. I say tongue in cheek. And so the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" She said, "The serpent duped me and I ate." So here it's important to note, I think, that when we're considering this story, there seem to be a lot of really kind of neat explanations for why things are the way they are. So why do men and women come together? Oh, because when woman was created out of man's rib, then they cleaved together and they became as one flesh. So we have this kind of account for why men and women come together. We also have this account in this narrative for why snakes have no legs. Oh, it's because that was the divine punishment. So a term that we often will use for this kind of narrative, which explains just sort of in a descriptive mythological sense why things are the way they are, that is called etiology. And so we get these kind of etiological punishments that seem to provide an explanation for the state of affairs in today's world. So obviously, as I said, the snake loses his legs, snake slithers. For the woman, her punishment is that she's going to have pain in childbirth. Why do women suffer pain in childbirth? Oh, well, it's because of this one woman. And there is also this expectation that she will desire her husband, but he will have ultimate power and domain over her. And for the man, it is that the land is now cursed. It is not this beautiful flowing Garden of Eden, but that he will have to work harder. Interesting as well that the punishments for the snake and for the woman are very sort of physically incumbent upon themselves. So the snake literally loses appendages. The woman experiences very intense pain, and also kind of a sort of demotion in terms of her own authority and power, according to this narrative. For the man, it's that the land externally is a little bit harder for him to deal with. And so that's also an interesting observation. What about LGBTQ folk? That's a really interesting and wonderful question. This narrative doesn't seem to be considering that possibility because it was composed and written and told and shared, preserved thousands of years ago, and this would not have been a concern in that moment. It becomes really important and interesting when we extend these texts and these narratives into our present day circumstances, and when they inform the ways in which we relate to one another and the ways in which we legislate, the rules between men and women, all of those things, and non-binary folk and trans folk. But in this case, we're coming from a very particular perspective, a very particular kind of way of seeing the world, and something we're going to kind of reflect on and come back to is this necessarily prescriptive for all time, that all men and women should cleave to one another? Or is this more descriptive of a reality that these ancient authors saw and that they were trying to account for? And so these are kind of the questions that I'm really glad you brought up, and we're going to definitely continue to return to as we keep going. So I think we're all familiar with the creation accounts of Genesis at this point. I'm sorry if some of that was a little repetitive in terms of already knowledge that you had. But I think it's interesting and important as well to kind of reread some of these narratives that are so familiar and so embedded in our culture and actually notice the things that we maybe take for granted. So the fact that the first 3 chapters of Genesis seem to, be read as one continuous story, and yet there are discrepancies in those first chapters alone. There's also discrepancies we find in terms of different literary sources that are used for the flood of Noah. There's different numbers of animals. So nothing in Jewish tradition is ever really can be tied down into one solid answer. There's always multiple truths. There's always multiple ways of understanding a particular story. And that makes sense because in our text, in the opening chapters that we read, there are points of difference. And the question becomes, how do we kind of interpret, how are we to understand these things that seem to be, from a modern perspective, in conflict? How can we read them in conjunction together? And so I just want to take a look at this question of ancient Israel, the society that produced these stories that we are reading. Yes, Aaron, the Talmud acknowledges that there are more categories than simply male and female, but it's not very nice about it. So we're going to explore some of that. What's important to notice, to note in here as well, is that I'm walking you through a semi-loosely chronological account of different Jewish sources. And so in these early sources, some of the nuance, some of the questions that are going to really animate future readers of these texts, future interpreters, these are not necessarily the questions or the concerns of the community that's producing them. And so, you know, we would love to know a lot of these answers of things that don't necessarily make sense or add up. But the people writing these texts and the people preserving these texts, they did not always have the same questions as us. And so it's going to be really interesting as we move forward. I did want to talk about this idea of ancient Israel and the society that produces most of these texts of the Hebrew Bible in terms of the idea of patriarchy. And I can read, or if someone wants to volunteer, I'll give a couple seconds. Anyone can read that italicized quote, but if in 5 seconds no one does, take over.
I can read it.
Thank you. Yeah.
At the top.
Yeah, in italics, the Genesis portrays.
Yeah. Genesis portrays a people whose women do not appear to exercise power in the public realm, but who hold considerable power in the private realm of household and children. Theirs is a different world and a different way of imagining and ordering reality from our own. Yet they too love spouses and children, resent siblings, mourn the loss of kin, fear and face deprivation in the form of famine and infertility, attempt to take stock of the comprehensible and make sense of the incomprehensible features of their existence. Susan Niditch.
Yep, thank you so much. Susan Niditch is a scholar of no problem. It's not clear if you don't know the person you're talking about. Thank you so much for reading that. I really like that quote. And I think it's important for sort of framing this idea that we're going to come back to as we look through some of the other Genesis narratives. So we started with creation, but we're going to take a step forward in the book of Genesis and look at some accounts, some characters and stories where on the one hand, and on paper, women don't seem to be the ones in charge, the ones with authority and power. But what's really interesting is, you know, on the one hand, it's very easy and straightforward to read these stories in that way. On the other hand, what we find is that actually, in many of these cases, the women are, if not the ones in positions of authority, they remain the drivers of the action of the story and of what comes next. And they have real power and influence, not always in ways that we might see as direct or obvious or apparent. And so this idea, Carol Myers refers to, she's a biblical and ancient Jewish scholar of ancient Judaism, who has identified this idea when we're talking about ancient Israel. On the one hand, the very basis of how society is structured, on the one hand, is very much male-oriented, and yet to simply view women's power as being in deference to or as lower than male power is also to discount the ways in which women hold and exercise power and influence and utilize that power, as I said, to kind of drive narratives and agendas forward. And so something to kind of consider when we're looking at these coming stories is that the familial structure, I mentioned already, that even though in modern Judaism and for many, many centuries, lineage has been matrilineal. So it's if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish, that's the standard line. In biblical narrative, this is not the case. And so there is an emphasis on these male lineages. And part of that is it's really reinforced and encoded by the structure of land. So inheritance is passed down in ancient Israel through the males. So the land is sometimes referred to as the birthright. And we also will have in some narratives talk of a blessing. And this blessing is this special covenantal relationship between God and his people Israel, which is marked by circumcision, obviously an act that in Judaism only happens for males. And so there is inherently, on the basis of land and on the basis of sort of the theological lineage, there's already this priority given to males, and the stories that we read and the lineages we follow are all from those male lines and focused on those male progeny. And so this is also kind of reinforced through the home structure. So not only is the land passed down through the fathers, but that is always a kind of locus point for the community as well. And so the standard household is referred to as a beit or house of the father. And this would be comprised of several generations, typically being inherited by the oldest son. And so if we're thinking about sort of social structure in antiquity here, we're thinking of kind of a unit in a larger clan. Often there's a shared ancestor. For an oldest male child, he's going to know that he's inheriting the land from his father. For a woman, when she marries into a family, she goes to the father's house, the beit of her husband. And so the basic parameters around which men and women are living and moving around and navigating are very much male oriented. So we can see it as kind of this patriarchal structure. But what I'm interested in exploring is, as I mentioned, the kind of the term here, heterarchy, refers to hetero as being different and the different kind of layers of power and authority. So just because the land and these covenantal blessings are given to the male and the female, this doesn't necessarily mean that every single aspect of society is the male domain. And there are certain avenues and places where women actually do hold more authority, which is deemed their responsibility, their right to kind of make decisions. And so this idea, not just of a patriarchy which subsumes difference, we have to kind of acknowledge the framework of patriarchy that encases these stories. But I think what we also might lose if we overemphasize that is where and how women also maintain and maintain their authority and make change. And so this is something we're going to come back to. Another story is from Genesis. So we are likely all pretty familiar with the story of Rebecca, Jacob. So biblical scholar Susan Niditch, who we just read her words, she talks a lot in her scholarship about how some of these early ancestors in Genesis are often portrayed as kind of underdogs. And, we love to root for an underdog who are outside of the establishment and who achieve success in roundabout ways, often through deception or trickery. And so does anybody want to kind of recount or go over a abbreviated form of the story of Jacob and Rebecca? I can do it too, but if anyone wants to kind of give us their take in a couple sentences of what happens there. Yay, nay? Again, I have it sort of spelled out. So there are two brothers, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the eldest. Esau is supposed to inherit both the land being the birthright and also this covenantal blessing, which is the special relationship to God, which is passed down from father to son. Earlier in this narrative, there is a short little aside about how Esau is so hungry one day and he's so into his food and he's this big, hairy, hungry guy that he actually gives up his birthright, his sort of land portion, to Jacob in exchange for some red soup. And then there is a nice little etiology of the neighboring land of Edom, or in Hebrew, red, and why they are related to Israel. And they are actually sort of brothers and familial. There are these points of connection, but they are a separate nation from ancient Israel. And so on the one hand, you already see this kind of deception, this trickery, where Jacob exploits his older brother's hunger in order to get something that is not necessarily owed to him by default. He is not the eldest brother. He should not inherit these things, but already he has kind of found a way to, to get what he wants in this. But then what happens in the second half of the story? So we know already that the land portion, the birthright, is going to be given to Jacob, the younger sibling, and not Esau, his brother. But it's actually the mother, Rebecca, who makes this all happen and gets the younger brother Jacob to also inherit this covenantal blessing from their father. And so is anyone familiar with what happens here? It's kind of a funny story. We have a little picture of Lego, Rebecca, everybody here.
Kills him.
Mm-hmm. So what did someone say? We have Rebecca, who is the wife of Isaac, the patriarch. And does anyone want to help fill in this story, or should I keep going?
Well, she encourages Jacob to dress up like his brother and pretend to be him when his father is blind, and take advantage of the blindness to get the blessing.
Exactly. There's one other part that's really important here, that the picture is actually helping to illustrate. Rebecca also helps Jacob, her favorite son, in another way. Do we remember what that is? So part of this is that Esau is sent out into the field, and he is sent to go hunting for game to prepare a special meal for Isaac towards the end of his life, for Isaac to then bless his son over this sort of ritual sacrifice. And so what Rebecca does is she is seemingly more of a whiz in the kitchen, and she is able to prepare the food faster than Esau can go out into the field, gather it, collect it, and present it to his father and prepare it. And so she provides her son with both, the clothing, the furs. Jacob doesn't really have any real reservations morally about taking his brother's blessing. He's already taken the land. But his main objections are, well, my brother is a very hairy man and I'm not hairy. And so Rebecca says, that's easy. I'm going to give you these furs and you're going to feel hairy to your blind father. And then she also provides him the food that she's already prepared, so that he can beat his older brother to it. And so she also, the other objection that Jacob raises to his mother is that he's afraid of any curses that might befall him for when his father and his brother realize that the wrong brother has the blessing. And she very quickly says, any curses that might come upon you, I take ownership for, I take accountability for. You go do your thing. Here's your furs and here's your meat. And she also then advises Jacob to flee to her brother Laban in Haran, because when Esau comes back and realizes that his brother has stolen this blessing and usurped him essentially, and now the eldest brother has neither land nor blessing. That is a huge problem for Esau. He's very angry. And so Rebecca says, I know a place for you to hide. And she also helps convince her husband Isaac that Jacob's trip to Haran is actually his, being Isaac's idea. So she really kind of helps lead everybody into the roles that she wants, because ultimately she, in her heart, wants her younger son Jacob to receive that blessing. And so I've kind of looked at these actions in terms of a few different things. On the one hand, there is a clear sense of agency that Rebecca, on the one hand, she has a goal in mind. It differs from her husband's, and her husband is the one to grant that authority of the blessing. Her husband is the one who can pass down this particular gift. And Rebecca, on paper, does not really have a say about it. But what does she do? She sort of uses her position as wife and as mother. She overhears what's happening. She is able to channel her knowledge of the household, her knowledge of her husband, all of these things, and get the result that she wants. In this as well, we also see a kind of wisdom that Rebecca exhibits. She's really, as I said, kind of leading what's going on in this story. She listens closely to what's happening. She works behind the scenes to accomplish her goals. And yet, as I mentioned, at the same time, there are these limitations. And so her power is achieved through the success of her male child. And it's also grounded in the preparation of serving of food in part, which, you know, to 20th and 21st century, okay, I don't think her job is only in the kitchen, but here, her knowledge of the kitchen, her knowledge in that realm actually helps her to execute her goals. And what's really interesting about this here is that later on in this narrative, God appears to Jacob, affirms his covenant with him. He seems to have no issue with the younger brother usurping the elder brother. And in fact, later on, Jacob is going to be renamed by a messenger or an angel of God as Israel. So Jacob himself becomes the namesake for the entire people on which these foundational stories are. And so, you know, the origins for the Jewish people did not come from the lineage of Esau. They came from Jacob. And who is responsible for this switch? It's not actually really Jacob in some ways. He's not the initiator of any of this. It's his mother, Rebecca, who drives this forward. And so we can see her in this narrative as kind of subverting traditional male power as a kind of trickster figure. Yes, Shoshana.
Well, she also, I think, was getting back at her father, who she was supposed to marry Isaac, and his father had him marry Leah first, right? Like he worked for 5 years or whatever, married Leah by mistake, worked for another 5 years, married Rebecca. So Rebecca was probably pissed off at her father for all of this waiting.
Yeah. So what's really interesting is that you're right. And if you follow the kind of accounts of these genealogies and these lines, there is actually a consistent kind of layer of deception and trickery that happens here. And so, you know, her actions are for sure in response to events and conditions of her own life. But it's really interesting how on the one hand, you know, she's married off to whomever secondary to her sister, for example, but she makes sure for her sons that she has a say on who's doing what and who gets what. And so even though Isaac has the traditional authority, he is the one who confers blessings, he is the one who makes the decisions on land and all of these traditional patriarchal roles, he's actually, physically blind, and not that with it in terms of knowing what's going on. It's Rebecca who sets this story in motion. And a lot of commentators will say that the coming scene of God appearing to Jacob and reaffirming this covenant with Jacob specifically serves as a kind of ratification of Rebecca's decision, that Rebecca, even though she went through devious means, this was what God wanted. God has no problem with it. And so it's really interesting that, this flies in the face of expectations of how this should have played out. But here we have it. And I have another story that I wanted to share and talk a little bit about. This one is perhaps a little less familiar. Does anyone know the story of Tamar and Judah? I'm just curious. I had a Bible prof who would always say, this is not the one they taught you in Sunday school. It's not the most G-rated story, but it's really interesting. Yes, Aaron. Did you want to kind of share a little bit of what you remember of the story? We're gonna walk through it and kind of analyze, but I'd love to kind of get.
Yes. Tamar was to be married off to Judah's sons, if I got the people right. And and the first one died, leaving her childless. The second one dies, leaving her childless. And Judah won't give her the third one because she's afraid of the curse.
Yes, exactly.
And then there's more.
There's more. So we're going to get to that more. So one thing to note that's really interesting. So the first son, heir, the firstborn, promised, betrothed to Tamar, but he dies shortly thereafter. And so I have this little asterisk here that
levirate marriage.
Levirate marriage. So Aaron or someone else, or do you want to kind of explain a little bit of what that practice is for anyone who might not be as familiar?
Yeah, if a husband dies leaving his wife childless, the husband's brother is required to marry her.
Yeah.
And the rabbis really hate this concept in the Talmud.
Yeah, well, it turns out that actually some of the people in these biblical stories don't love it either. And so the second son here is named Onan. And what he realizes is that when you are committing this act of levirate marriage, the offspring that you produce is in all manners, like legal and in terms of kind of inheritance, the child actually is the direct descendant in this sort of societal framework of the widower, of the man who has died. And so the problem here is that if heir was the eldest and Onan is reproducing with heir's widow Tamar, the child that ensues from that union will have priority in terms of inheritance over Onan's own offspring, because it is the child of the eldest. Even though it's not exactly how it works, the birds and the bees, but within this framework, that is how it happens. And so what we have here is actually really interesting. Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste. And so he spills his seed, quote unquote. And this is where we get a lovely term, onanism, for the practice of masturbation, which, in particular, the Catholic Church has some feelings about, but it's in response to this story where God is clearly upset that Onan did not fulfill his duty as the next of kin. And here we have this lovely Lego illustration of Onan spilling his seed that I'm just
that's what I was going to ask.
So that's a little it's very creepy. So I noted the law that this levirate marriage practice is coming from, but we can kind of move on. And so as Aaron noted, we get some really interesting developments in this story. And so Tamar, who is the widow that is left behind for these two brothers, the third brother is younger, and Judah, his father, is saying, we'll send you to her. We'll send him to you when he is old enough. And part of this is rooted in this fear that, my first two sons died when they married this woman. Maybe I'm not going to risk my third. And so she is unfortunately left in this position where she doesn't really have anywhere to go. So as we talked about before, there is the bait of that you grow up in the house of the father. And so Tamar would have grown up in her familial or ancestral home. When she married, she would have moved into the home of Judah, into that bait of kind of complex. And the problem here is that when Judah makes it clear that she doesn't really belong, she's in that household anymore, she is actually sent back to her father's household, where there is also no space for her. And so she is caught in this kind of catch-22. She's married out of her own ancestral home, and she's not really welcomed or wanted in the home of her husband, who is not yet her husband, because the first two have died. And so what does she do here? She takes actions into her own account. So, and as I kind of mentioned, she uses deception to get what she needs. So she actually takes off her widow's garb, covers her face with a veil, and sits down at the entrance to a Naim. She saw that the son Shelah, the son of Judah, was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. And so what does she do? She waits on the side of the mountains as Judah is going to this fair, basically, and she propositions him as a prostitute, which, according to this narrative, is maybe not that uncommon. And she asks him, what are you going to give me for sleeping with me? And he says, I'll send a kid for my flock. And he's going to market in order to earn money, earn revenue, but he does not yet have anything to really leave behind. So she asks for some kind of pledge in lieu of actual payment. And so she asks for his seal and cord and staff, which he carries. And so in this story, she sleeps with her father-in-law, yucky, yucky. And then when she inevitably gets pregnant, he is going to be punished immediately. So Judah is told, your daughter-in-law has played the harlot. She is with child by harlotry. She's been an adulterer. And Judah says that she's going to be burned. And there's lots that we can kind of look at next week, hopefully, if we have some time, about sort of these legal rulings on adultery. And there's really interesting distinctions on the punishment of the men versus the women and how extreme these go. We don't necessarily know that these rules were always enacted, but they are preserved and they are written from a particular perspective. And so I wish we could use this word without reference to other things, but she kind of pulls out her trump card here. As Tamar was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law, I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she holds up the seal and the cord and the staff. And Judah recognized them, saying, she is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he was not intimate with her again. Thank you so much for clarifying that detail. And so what we have here, we have this lovely illustration of her in a COVID-appropriate mask. Stay safe, everybody. And in disguise. And she actually produces an heir. And what's really interesting is that this narrative goes on to tell us a whole set of genealogy that goes from Tamar onto the next generation, et cetera, all the way until we get to the lineage of King David, who we're going to talk about him as well next week. Kind of an important guy, kind of a big deal. And so once again, we sort of see this way in which a woman in this instance is able to harness the limited power she does have in a society that is really not structured to support or help her in a lot of ways necessarily, especially when something goes wrong, when something does not fit into these standard options for a woman, and when her role is somewhere in between stages of where she quote unquote should be. And she takes action and it seems to work out pretty well for her. her father-in-law says, I was wrong. This is, the patriarch Judah, also kind of a big deal. He doesn't sleep with her again, and she lives her life more securely and now that she has an heir, she has a home base to stay, and she has a role within that familial structure again. And so I like to bring that story on the one hand just because it's very bizarre, but also I think it provides some really interesting sort of room for questions and for consideration. So I've obviously been kind of arguing a certain point, but I'd love to hear from you all about this question of agency. How do you think these women exercise agency in these narratives? How is power being used and exercised in these stories? Are there any kind of observations or questions? Or answers to questions? Like if we're going to do a raise of hands kind of, oh, I see. Yeah, there is a hand.
So people might say that the women were conniving as sort of a negative, going behind their husband's back or
right.
against what the norms were for the times. But in essence, women didn't go to battle and use their wisdom to outsmart the enemies in that way. They were using their wisdom for power, just like men used their wisdom to gain power on the battlefield, to outsmart people who weren't advocating for them, but for themselves. So in essence, this is a parallel kind of use of strategy to gain their outcomes that they wanted.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. Thank you. Is it Karen? I see two names on the screen.
Karen, yeah. Fred went to a choir rehearsal.
Good for him. Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And I'm so glad you brought up this idea, this association we have with deception, with this kind of trickery that we see in these narratives, that women often get characterized as being conniving. But what's really interesting to note is kind of the layers of interpretive history and assumptions that we also bring to these narratives that, a lot of heroes in ancient stories and ancient myths are conniving. Like think of the great classics, the Greek classics, Odysseus, his main characteristic is that he's a very slippery guy. He's always outsmarting his opponents, but he's also a hero. And so, there is a sense of when your strategy plays out and it works for you, that is something to be celebrated. And there is not necessarily, I think we tend to characterize things as good, bad, whatever. But it's also interesting here, these characters in many ways are successful. And yet I saw that there was a hand from Shoshana. I just kind of want to frame this other part of this question, and then I definitely want to hear from you. I think it's interesting to ask kind of, is there agency in spite of their gender, because of it? Yes, both and, neither or. So Shoshana, I want to go to you, and I see that Nan also raised. Nan, you raised your hand as well. So we'll do Shoshana first.
Sure, thanks. I'm kind of thinking of how, in this society, the covenant, right, was the circumcision. So that was like the penis is giving them power to have this blessing, to be head of household, etc.
Yeah.
And here are these women using their bodies in the way that they can to get what they need, which is security.
Right.
And so the men have security through their penises, and the women are doing what they need to do.
Yeah.
In Tamar's case, especially using Judah's penis against him.
Right. Definitely. That's a really great point. Thank you so much, Shoshana. Nan, your hand was also up. Oh, I think you're muted still.
Sorry.
No worries.
When I read these stories, one of the things that I try and look at is the end result before I look at the content, the whole content. And if we wind up with Tamar having a legacy of heirs or people who come from her and keep on, you've got all these generations that are said to be of Tamar's descendants, that the way I always wonder if these stories that talk about things like trickery or acting as a prostitute or whatever, if it's a way of trying to diminish the memory of the power that these women had in reality, and yet that they were so important that their stories had to be kept in even these very patriarchal stories. You know, that the memory was so big and so powerful that they're still being talked about, but that they're being talked about in a way to try and diminish their actual authority.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think you see similar stuff. I wish we had more time. You could do a whole course just on kind of this study of goddess worship, actually, in ancient Israel and sort of in early Judaism, where, and there are these impacts that a lot of these texts are coming from predominantly oral traditions. And so there is this culture of storytelling. There are these kind of parts of the story that you need to hit, kind of like in a movie remake. You have to have some version of this famous scene, or people are going to be confused. People are going to be upset. And yet, how do you maybe position it in a way that diminishes or downplays? I think that's a really interesting dimension to bring to these texts for sure. I also want to call attention though to texts in which, the men are also tricksters, and they're definitely not, seen as being particularly negative. So for instance, there is a recurring story that happens seemingly perhaps from different textual traditions, where Abraham goes into various lands, like in Egypt. He's on his way to the land of Canaan, and he tells a bunch of people that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. And there are consequences to that, depending on which version of that story you read. And it's so that he eventually can get the upper hand. So, he basically scares the Pharaoh into providing him with all of this money and this gold and silver and stuff. And yet that's not particularly ethical. At the same time, Abraham is, the first real, what we might think of as like this first monotheist often in tradition, this first person who, turned aside from the idols of his father, started this lineage. All of the texts that we read in the Hebrew Bible are about these descendants, presumably of Abraham. And yet, there seem to be different moral standards, the things that we might think of as problematic, as not great. Sometimes, those things hold true. Sometimes there are different standards by which ancient audiences and ancient listeners and storytellers would be thinking about these things. Nan, did you raise your hand again, or is that still up? Oh, no worries.
No, I didn't take it off yet.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you didn't have another question. I see we're coming up to the end of time, but I did want to kind of end with this question that I brought up towards the beginning. Are these stories meant to be descriptive or prescriptive? And I don't think there's an easy answer necessarily to that question. I don't think it's neat. And I think in different time periods, we've seen different interpretations of those answers to the question. But it's important to note, especially as people, I'm presuming you're all coming from the extended Shir Tikva community, so largely Jewish. But anyone really who reads these stories, these biblical narratives have a huge impact in how sort of society has been organized, in how our sense of ethics and morals have been derived. And yet, were they composed and preserved with that in mind? Were they meant to be always illustrative or actually prescriptive? Were they meant to tell us how to live, or to kind of account for why things are the way they are? So we come back to that idea of kind of ideology, of a kind of one of the functions of a lot of myth is explaining why things are the way they are. So when we think about sort of the impact of these narratives, the impact of these character tropes, it's important, I think, to consider, we have assigned a certain value to these writings and to these textual traditions, to these stories, and they have a great deal of value for us in the ways in which we have read them historically and continue to read them today. And it's also really important at the same time to recognize that none of these narratives, none of these texts were constructed or written in a kind of bubble, that they had a context. And that when we bring these texts into other contexts, there are interpretive choices and decisions that we make as well. And so I think that hopefully this provided you a little bit of a sense of some of the topics that are yet to come. I know we kind of started at the bare bones with Genesis, but I always loved Genesis and starting with those simple stories because, as Fräulein Maria said, it's a very good place to start. So thank you all. And I can stay on for a couple more minutes if anyone has any questions, but otherwise, hope to see you same time next week.
Thanks a lot, Simon.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Yeah.
Thanksgiving.
You
Thanks,
too.
Simon.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.